Hey there. Today we're going to take a look at how I use MobX, a popular state management library, in a new React project to implement authentication with a JSON web token. And we're going to use a backend that I've already developed in a previous video. We're going to use MobX to store the access token after we retrieve it from the backend in the UI. We'll have a login modal like this, as we see. And then after we log in, our access token will be saved in the application in local storage so that when we refresh the app, the token is persisted. And I'll show you how to set up a store in MobX so that we can use this access token anywhere we need. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so before we actually start building out our authentication on the UI, we're going to need a backend service running that will be able to provide our UI with an access token. So in order to do this, I'm going to be running the Nest.js server that I've done a tutorial on in one of my previous videos. So I'm going to go ahead and clone that repo, and I'll put the URL in the description. So I'm going to clone that repo. I'm going to check out into that folder, and I'm going to check out onto the auth branch, because that's where the authentication code is. And then from there, I'm going to run a yarn and then yarn start dev so that our server will be running. So if I open up the backend server in VS Code, we can see that our user service is just a hard-coded list right now. So in our example that we walk through, we're just going to use this in-memory representation of an example user. So I also have this auth folder set up, which contains all of the logic to get a token back if you provide the correct email and password. Like I said before, one of my other videos goes through this in depth. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and just make sure that when we launch a request to the backend, the route is auth/login, and we pass that email and password that we have hard-coded in memory right now. When we shoot that request off, after we start the server, yarn start dev. So once the server starts up and we go back into Postman, we should be able to send this request and get back an access token. And this is important because the React application will be sending a request with an email and a password and getting that access token back. So we're going to have to use this access token in future requests to authenticate ourselves and tell our backend server that we are who we are saying we are. So with this backend service in place, let's go ahead and actually start building out the React UI. Okay, so in order to bootstrap our application, we're going to use create React app, which is a CLI that will set everything up we need to start a new React project up. So we're going to use npx create React app, and then you can call it whatever. I'm going to call this React Auth. And I'm also going to use a TypeScript template because I want to have my React code in TypeScript. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is open up the React Auth project in VS Code, and in my React Start script, I'm going to go ahead and just add at the start of the script here, I'm going to add port is equal to 3001. And that's because my Nest.js server is listening on port 3000 already. So now if we start the React's development server, so if you open up your browser and go to localhost 3001, you should see the React starting page. So now we can go ahead and open up the project in VS Code. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do when I open up is just get rid of all the starting files here. I'll get rid of the CSS file and the testful file that automatically gets generated. I'll get rid of the testing and web vitals code as well, as I'm not going to be using this. I'll go ahead and get rid of the logo, this boilerplate CSS. I'm not going to need it. So all we're left with is the index.tsx, so we'll get rid of the web vital usage here. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and remove everything in this app.tsx and then make sure we're actually still importing React from React. but I'm going to declare a const here. I'm going to have a functional component of a type React.functional component. And then in here, this is just how I like to structure my components. So we'll have just an empty div right now. And then I don't want to use default exports. I just prefer to have named exports. So we go back into index.tsx and just make sure that this import gets updated. And just make sure we move our import to the index.css up here. So in order to store application state in our React app, that is to maintain an access token and to allow our requests to be authenticated over the lifetime of our app, we're going to need some sort of state management. And I'm going to use MobX for that because it's a great, small, lightweight library that allow us to maintain state in our application in a very flexible way. I'm going to add MobX. So if we type yarn add MobX, so make sure we also add MobX React Lite, which is our React adapter for MobX. Now with the concept of MobX, we have the idea of creating stores, and these stores will be classes, ES6 classes that will store our data, but also provide methods to manipulate and use that data. So it really allows us to program in a very object-oriented way, which is something I really like about this library. So to see a closer look at this, in the source directory, I'm going to create a new directory called stores. And this is where we're going to keep all the stores. And while we're at it too, I'll create another directory here called components. I'll actually go ahead and move my app component in there. I actually just create a new folder called app. It's just kind of how I like to structure my projects. And I'm going to rename it app.component.tsx. I'm a fan of this naming convention here. So then we can see at our index.tsx, the import automatically got updated. So the store that I'm going to go ahead and create is called the Auth store. So it'll be called auth.store.ts. And this is just going to be a class that I'll call Auth store. And this class will contain all of the functionality required around authentication in my application. So what MobX allows us to do is declare properties on this class or object, which is what it'll turn into. It allows us to turn these properties into observables. So we can declare private properties and tell MobX that when these properties change, our React components should then react to that change in state and then update accordingly. So there's kind of a manual way to do this where we can define the properties, or instead we can have MobX do this for us. And to see what I mean by this, they have this function called make auto observable, which will take in the this keyword as a parameter, so that it takes all of the properties of the auth store and makes them observables and automatically detects our methods that will mutate these properties so that our React components will update. So we just need to make sure we import this make auto observable from MobX. So in this case, I'm going to have a private field called authenticated, and it's going to be false by default. But what's great about MobX is it allows us to still have our data hiding and have private properties on a class, and then we can introduce getters. So we can introduce a separate method here called isAuthenticated that clients or our application will call to check if we are authenticated, and all we're going to do is return this authenticated. So this way, no one can mutate this property authenticated except for the auth store itself. And when this property does change, the make auto observable will make sure that our components that are listening to the auth store get re-rendered, and we'll see how this connection takes place in a little bit. So this is great. We have this concept of stores now, and we could have a store for anything in our application, for notifications, users, any sort of domain entities you have in your app. You can have a separate store for it, and you should, as you want to keep this logic as separate as possible. But then the question comes, okay, how do we use this store, or how do we inject it into our components. And I find the best way to do this is to use React's context API. And what that will allow us to do is have one object that is passed down to our components. So in this case, that object will contain all of the stores and all of the state we need in our app. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at this. I'll create a new file here called store.context.ts. So if you're familiar with dependency injection, this is this store context here is what we'd call the composition root. So this is where in the application we are going to instantiate all of these stores that will be injected into our components via the context API. So let's go ahead and create our first store. So we have our auth store here, and we'll instantiate the new auth. Okay, and the next I'm going to declare an interface here called iStoreContext, because this will be the interface of our store context, and each entry into this store context will be a separate store. So in this case we have the auth store, and so now we can actually export our store context, which is our shared application state, which will be accessible in our components. So we're going to call React.createContext and make sure we import React. So createContext takes a type here, and we can pass in the iStore context so that we have type information, and then we're just going to pass in an object. This is the shared state with the auth store. So now we have this store context, we have this composition root where we're going to instantiate all of our stores in our application right when the application starts, and we're going to export this so that our components can consume it. So to see how we can actually use this store context we've just created, I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder under our components directory called Auth, and this folder will contain all of the components associated with our authentication in the UI. In this example, I'm just going to try to present a dialog, a UI dialog, to the user if the app detects that they are not authenticated, and at that point we're going to ask the user to log in so that we can ask our backend for an access token. So I'm going to create an auth.component. It's have a similar structure to our app component, so I'll just copy this boilerplate over. So I'm going to change the name of this component to auth view, and the reason why I'm going to do that is because I'm going to declare a new const down here and call this const auth, and I'm going to use observer, and observer, we import observer from MobX React Lite. And what observer does is it takes the React component that we supply and it automatically subscribes or listens to any change in state from those observables that we set up elsewhere. So in the example here in our auth store, the observer listens for any properties that are marked as observables and that are actually used in the component. And when those properties change, it re-renders the component, so our UI will update. So it's very efficient. Only the components that it detects a change in will actually re-render, which is a great advantage of MobX. So now we can export the auth component here. And now in our auth view component, we can get access to the store context. So I'm actually going to destructure the auth store. And then we can call use context from React and pass in the store context. So now we have access to the auth store inside of the auth view component, which is great. So I can actually create a variable here called authenticated and set it equal to auth store dot is authenticated. So now whenever the authentication state changes in my auth store, this const here will change because that's an observable that we're listening to. And when this value changes, our UI will update. So let's go ahead and implement this simple dialog that will prompt the user to log into our app. So in order to build a quick dialog and some nice looking input fields, I'm going to make a use of Material UI, which is a great React UI library that lets you create some really great components that look and work great out of the box. So if we look here, it's a quick one-line install here with yarn. So I'm going to copy this line here, paste it in, and we're going to add material UI. Okay, so back in our Auth view component here, I'm just going to go ahead and paste the example from the material UI docs, and we're going to import the dialog component from material UI. So we're just going to have it set open to true to make sure we can actually see the dialog. In our app component now, I'm going to go ahead and instead of returning an empty div, we can actually return our auth component. So after we include the auth component here, back in the auth component, actually, we're going to want to make sure we include some children so that the dialog will actually appear. So I'm just going to put in a paragraph tag and say this is a dialog. And once we save it, we should see it pretty ugly, but we should see the dialog in our React app. So that's great. Let's go ahead and actually flesh this out a bit more. So first of all, the open property is going to be whether or not we are currently authenticated. So if we're not authenticated, that's when I want to show the dialog. Okay, so next we're going to need some text fields so that we can get the user's login and password, or email and password. So I'm going to import similarly a text field from Material UI. And instead of this paragraph here, we're going to create a text field. We're going to create a new text field component, and we're going to give it a label of email. And we'll do the same for a password field right below. Okay, so I want to add a little bit of CSS to this modal just to give things a bit of space. So I'll add an auth.style.css, and this will just be a style sheet just for this component. So I'll add a container, and I'll give this this dialog container a padding of, let's say, 30 pixels. So this is going to be a surrounding div around our inputs. So I want to make sure our display is still set to flex, and our flex direction is column. So now back in here, let's go ahead and create a surrounding div, and we can give a class name of container to the div. Take these text fields here. We're going to go ahead and copy them inside the div, and just make sure we add a dot / here, and then looks like I just added some unnecessary quotes here, so make sure our display is flex. And then I'll add a class for the actual input themselves. So I'll add a class for text fields, and I'll give this a margin of 15 pixels. So now in our auth component, we can give a class name to these guys here. So now if we take a look at our React app, we should see a little dialog with an email and password fields, which is great. Let's just go ahead and finally finish this off with a button. So import the button from Material UI, and then we'll add the component in down below. So let's actually introduce some state here so that we can maintain the email and password and change them correctly. So local state, use state, the use state hook is still a great candidate for this kind of local state. Really, we only want to use MobX for state that needs to be shared between components in our application. But if it's state that just belongs to one component, we can still use state to hang on to this state. So let's do that. We'll have an email and set email, and call useState and import it from React. And we'll also have password and set password, and we'll call useState. So now we can provide values, and we can pass in the email, and we can similarly pass in a value for the password. We can also specify on change. So on change, we will get the new value, and we'll call set email with that value. We'll go ahead and do the same thing for password. We'll call on change, and we actually want to make sure that we're not passing the value because this is the event change object. So if we want to get the new value, we'll actually call this the event, and then we'll call or pull out the event.target.value, and that will be the new value. And we're also going to empty strings as the initial value for both of these, just to make TypeScript happy. So we'll do the same thing for the password. This will be the event, and we'll pass an event.target.value. So now when we change the password in the email, our state should be updated, and we should be able to see the change in the input fields themselves. So let's go ahead and try that out. Test at example.com and some dummy password. So we can also pass the type field to these inputs, just to give a little bit more information to the system that's using them. So we see for the password, after we provide the password, we should now see that our password here is protected. So next we need to add some logic so that when we click our login button, our auth store makes a request to our backend service with the user's credentials, checks to see if that's a valid login, and then returns us back an access token so we can authenticate the user and make future requests. So let's go ahead and implement that now back in our auth store. So in order to implement the functionality of our auth store being able to reach our backend and log in, I'm going to introduce the concept of services in this architecture, and the services are going to abstract away any communication with the backend, just to keep that code separate from the store itself. So what I'll go ahead and do is create a new folder, services, and we're going to see in a second here how I set up these services such that it's very easy to inject a service for each given store and use that service to communicate with the backend service. And also we'll have authentication taken care of. So let's take a closer look at this. So the first service we're going to need is an auth service, okay? And so this auth service is going to be responsible for reaching out to the backend and getting the access token we need. So I'm going to export a class called auth service, and we're going to have one public method called async login. Okay, and it's going to take a login request of type login request. Okay, so we need to define what this login request will look like. And because we're using the Nest.js auth backend that I've created in one of my previous videos, we know what the shape of this login request is going to look like. So I'll create a new folder called DTO, which stands for Data Transfer Object. In here, I'll create another folder called request. And this will hold all of my request data transfer objects, which are just going to be an interface which describe the data that I'm transmitting to my backend service. So we'll create a login request.dto. We'll export an interface called login request. And we're going to have two fields. Of course, we're going to need the email, which is a string. And then we're also going to need a password, which is a string. So these are the two bits of information we need to log into our backend service and get an access token. So now we can import the login request. And now I'm going to get a const here response and set it equal to await. We're going to use the fetch API to be able to reach out to our backend. Now I'm going to get an API URL, which So we're going to need to import. So I'm going to need to include the API URL here, and this will be localhost when we are running locally. But I want to be able to swap that out for a production URL when I'm building for a production environment. So to make this easier, what I'll do is I'll create another folder called utils, and in utils I'm going to create a url.ts. This will just be a list of URL related constants that I'm going to export. Okay. And I also just realized we created the auth service in the stores folder. Make sure we move it into the services folder. So I'm going to go ahead and export a const, and this will be a constant API URL. So we will then swap this out accordingly. If we have a production URL, we can put that here, but being able to have this in one spot makes it a lot easier to swap it out. So if we're running locally, I want to use localhost/3000. So now back in the auth service, I'm going to import the API URL. we're going to call auth/login, which, if we recall from the beginning of the video, is the same URL we used in Postman. And remember, we used that email and password to obtain the access token. So we're going to reach auth/login. This is going to be a post request. And then we can specify some headers here. We know that the content type is going to be application/JSON. And the body is going to be the stringified login request that we have up top. So now that we have this raw response, we're going to go ahead and parse it. So I'll create a new const parse response, and we'll call it await response.json to take the JSON. In order to convert this raw response, which is just a stream coming in from the backend, I want to convert it into readable JSON. And then I'm going to do a quick check to say that if the parse response is not okay, and this okay is part of the parse response after we turn it into JSON, I want to throw a new error, and I'm going to throw the parse response so that we can catch this higher up in the stack. Lastly, I'm going to return the parsed response. And before I move on here, just make sure we actually change this to if the response is not okay, because the okay property will be on the response object itself, not the parsed response. So now that we have this auth service set up, we can go back to our auth store. And in the constructor, we're going to have a very similar structure to if you've used Angular before. I like to practice dependency injection such that we can list out all the dependencies that each store is going to have in each service, such that if we need to swap out an auth service for a different one, as long as they conform to the same interface, we can do so at the composition root, which is what we will see in a second here. So to make this a bit more clear in our constructor, we're going to take in the auth service. And now we can create a new async login method. We know this is going to take a login request. It's going to take the username and password from the auth component. So we're going to create a new const here. I'm going to call it token payload data transfer object. Okay, and it's going to be await this dot auth service dot login, and we're just going to pass in that login request. So now that we have the token payload, I want to be able to save the access token that we've gotten back in the browser's memory. And in order to accomplish this, we can use local storage. So I'm going to call local storage dot set item. And what this will do is it'll allow us to persist the access token even if the user refreshes the application, which is great, so they don't have to log in every time. It's only if they clear their browser storage, then they'd have to log back in. So I'm going to call set item. I'm going to use access token here as the key, and then as the actual value, we're going to call token payload DTO, and we're going to get the access token off of that. Now the last step in this method is that we want to set this authenticated to true, because we know that the user successfully authenticated at this point. Now with MobX, when you work with asynchronous methods, you can't mutate class data directly in the async method because of the nature of how MobX reacts to asynchronous updates. There's a few ways that they recommend changing or mutating class data in an asynchronous method, and if you want to read more into it, I'll include the link to the description in the docs. But one of the ways we can get around this, and so the way I get around this is by using separate class setters for the class data. So we can just have a private setter called set is authenticated, or we'll say set authenticated. It'll take in authenticated, which is the Boolean, and we're just going to call this authenticated equal authenticated. So now instead of directly mutating the class data here, we'll call this set authenticated and pass true. And one last thing I want to do is I want to actually wrap this whole block here into a try catch statement, because if for some reason our request fails, which in case we know it will, if the user is not authenticated, if their credentials are invalid for some reason, we know that we threw an error earlier when we checked the response was okay. The response will not be okay if it comes back as unauthorized, which will happen if we use bad credentials. So if a bad response comes back from the server, then we want to do the opposite and set authenticated to false. So now that we've set up the login method in our auth store, we need to actually make sure in our composition root here, we need to make sure that we provide the auth store with the auth service. So what's great about this composition root here, this store context, is that we only need to declare these services and stores once, and then we can share them as singletons across each of our use cases. So we'll see that in a bit, how we end up sharing multiple services between different stores. But for now, I'm going to pass in the auth service into the auth store. And now if we come back into our auth component, and we can create an on-click listener for our login button, and we'll call our auth store .login, and we'll pass in our email and our password. So now when the user clicks the login button, we're going to call login on the auth store. We're going to ask the auth service to get a token for us from our backend. We'll set it on local storage, and then we'll update our observable value here to true so that we are authenticated. And then in the auth component, we only show the dialog if we're not authenticated. So this component will re-render when it detects that is authenticated has changed, and we will no longer show the modal. So let's go ahead and try this out. So make sure you have the backend service running from the beginning of the video, and I'm going to use the same login that we have used in Postman, because if you recall, we're just using a in-memory list right now of users with email and password. So we're going to use that for our login here. The email will be dan@example.com, and then it'll be my password for the password. And after we click login, we can see that the modal has disappeared because our component has re-rendered. We can see our login request came back successfully with an access token, which is great. We can now safely say that the user is authenticated. So if we go ahead and refresh the page, we'll notice that our dialog pops back up, which is quite strange because we'd expect that our access token is still in local storage. We take a look and we go under application and we look at local storage for HTTP localhost 3001. We can still see that we already still have an access token being saved. So we should not be presenting the modal to the user. And the reason why this is happening right now is because when we reload the application, we don't call login again. So let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to create a new public method called getAccessToken. And what this is going to do is it's going to check local storage. So we'll return this, we'll return local storage dot get item, and we'll look for access token. So if the current value is associated with the given key, the access token will return it, otherwise it'll return null. So in our constructor for the auth store, I'm actually going to set this authenticated equal to this dot get access token, and we can actually use the double bang here so that if the value is non-nullish, then this will be coerced into true, and if we get null back, it'll still be false, so the user is not authenticated. So now if we save and go back to our browser, we should see that even once we refresh the page, we're not presented with the login modal because we still have that token in memory. If we were to go ahead and clear that storage and refresh the page, we can see we're presented with the login again. And then once we log in and our access token is back, when we refresh, we can see that the modal disappears. So I hope you enjoyed this short tutorial on how I implement React authentication using MobX. If you'd like to see more videos with MobX, just let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks.